Hello, I'm going to present to you what I've been working on for this class. I decided to write a research paper instead of doing a creative project, so I'm going to read you the first paragraph of my paper and then talk a bit about how I fleshed out my arguments, how I connected them to things we talked about in class, and then finish just by talking a little bit about why I was drawn to this topic and why I chose to explore it as a research paper. So, the first paragraph of my paper is death and dying, despite being phenomena often cast to the far shores of collective consciousness within Western society, are nonetheless ubiquitous and universal facts which cut across, bind, and touch, albeit unequally, all possible identity categories. The states of grief, mourning, and bereavement thus become potent sites for the study and potential emergence of deep forms of coalition and political solidarity building. Importantly, however, the social construction of the meaning of mourning is necessarily structured within the specific cultural frames within which the bereaved orient to the grief work they undertake. These frames, as well as the questions as to which deaths count as ones deserving of mourning, render grief inherently political. Using this understanding as a springboard, I will argue that emergent digital technologies can be used as a form of alternative media that allow for a reconceptualization of mourning, bereavement, and death itself that resists the dominant narratives and structures imposed by neoliberal capitalism in generative and surprising ways. So, in my paper, I acknowledge that grief is a nuanced and complex experience that can encompass the loss of many things, including a relationship, a job, or an ideal. But for the purposes of my paper, I focus on grief that's precipitated by a death. So I use a social constructionist model of grief, wherein, as I mentioned, grief work is determined by the larger cultural frames and models provided under whatever system the person lives in. So specifically within Western neoliberal capitalism, grief is constructed as something to get through as quickly as possible. So what I'm arguing is that emergent digital technologies such as online memorials, digital manipulations of the deceased, or even digital archives that kind of queer the distinction between living and non-living life forms challenge this perception of death as a linear state to be moved through as quickly as possible. So just like, as we've talked about in class, alternative media should strive not to create binaries between mainstream and alternative media. I've found that these digital technologies also destabilize binaries, but specifically between life and death. So they do this in two main ways. One of them is through situating the bereaved within complex social networks. Recalling this concept of network sociality that we've talked a lot about in class. So for instance, through the creation of online memorials, the bereaved can access a community of other mourners who can then provide emotional and even financial support. But even more interestingly, these digital technologies also situate the deceased within complex digital networks, which challenge the assumed boundaries between life and death, and when does someone's identity, like, it challenges the idea that biological death is translated into a social death. And in this way, it kind of reconceptualizes death itself as a form of good design that connects human life to a system that's larger than themselves. And this idea of death as good design allows for a shift from anthropocentric to post-humanist design practices that position human life as a transitional state, and thus allows for the development of a prefigurative politics of the present. So a way to think about current social phenomenon in a more critical, speculative way. So yeah, I argue that this politicizes grief in a way that then reemphasizes the significance of the politics of the everyday by taking the meaning-making power away from traditional authorities and bringing it to a more grassroots community level. And then the varied narratives around grief that emerge acknowledge an intersectionality of grief that shifts away from a societal denial of death. Some theorists argue that forms of online memorials where the bereaved continue to try to maintain contact with the deceased in some way as a form of denying death. But I'm arguing that the space opened up for a reconceptualization of death and the role that that plays within life instead shifts away from a more societal denial of death and allows for a certain re-enchantment of society under neoliberal rationalist capitalism. And so in this way, grief emerges as a very non-linear, generative, and political experience that can allow for solidarity building and coalition building. And so instead of being seen as a very negative thing to be moved through as quickly as possible, it can be a very unifying, positive, and generative thing. But I do end with a note or a little warning that grief, like any other form of alternative media, can also be appropriated and turned into symbolic capital that can be used by these same hegemonic forces that digital media around grieving and death tries to step away from. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind about that. So I decided to write this paper because there aren't many resources about how to grieve and survive loss under capitalism. I'd really like to do a creative project about this at some point, but for the purposes of this class, I felt like a research paper would be more appropriate, just to avoid falling into a more kind of Perzine category. But that's definitely a project that I'd like to work on and that I feel inspired to work on, especially after writing this paper. So yeah, hope that you found that interesting, and I hope that everyone has a good holiday break.